Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel Sportsbook. College football week 10 as the calendar moves from October to November, and we get the first unveiling of the college football playoff rankings. I am your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. Want to remind all of you, our loyal listeners, like we do every week here on the Bet the Board podcast, FanDuel.com/BetTheBoard. Use the promo code BetTheBoard. Take advantage of all of the great promotions and new user signups that FanDuel has made available to you, whether it's a $1,000 risk-free bet, enhanced odds, single game parlay pricing, or 30-1 prices available on a trio of NFL games this weekend, whether it's Green Bay, Kansas City, Houston, Miami, New England, Carolina. New users, 30-1 available as you have a chance to build your bankroll. Payne, I know you look forward to all of this in early November when the pollsters in a committee room that watches no college football all season long takes the entire sport by the short hairs.
Yeah, you guys get all worked up over it. It's the first iteration for me. That this is all posturing. There's really nothing to be taken from this, in my opinion. I know you think a little bit differently, but a team like Oklahoma, for instance, I'm not getting my panties in a ruffle that they're 8th, right? And the committee came out and said, hey, they didn't really play anybody. All of which is true. But you have a game off your bye at Baylor. You get Iowa State. And then you close the season at Oklahoma State. And then you have the Big 12 championship game. So if they win out, I think you'll see them in the Final Four. I think you'll see a situation where they would leap an Oregon at that point with one loss.
Well, that begs the bigger question. If you go through it, and we can start with Oklahoma, who is a $1.75 favorite as things stand right now on FanDuel Sportsbook to get into the college football playoff. I do find that number a little bit odd, not because of what the odds imply, but the fact that you just outlined there. If Oklahoma were to run the table and probably have to win the conference championship game, a 4-team moneyline parlay rollover is going to pay substantially better than minus $1.75. But at the same time, when you look at some of the teams in front of them, Michigan, of course, we know still has a couple of landmines left, mainly Ohio State, their final regular season game. Michigan State, who sits inside the top 4, well, they're going to be more than a 2-touchdown underdog as things project out against Ohio State. I believe that game's in Columbus. If it's not, then main number may come a bit shorter. And Oregon clearly still has some work to be done, including what may set up to be 2 games against Utah with a game sandwiched in the middle against the Washington State. So there's no doubt a lot of dominoes are set to fall in all of this, but you do try and play some of these things out. If Ohio State were to run the table, if Alabama were to beat Georgia and Oregon wins out, you think Oklahoma would theoretically have enough quality wins on their resume over the back half of the schedule to jump a 12-1 Pac-12 champion in the Oregon Ducks?
I do. And I'm not a big Oregon guy, and I think most people know that.
Yep.
In saying that, right, I mean, Oklahoma is going to go through a gauntlet here. I mean, Baylor is better than we expected, and that's going to be a road game against a top 15 opponent, most likely. Oklahoma State's a 1-loss team at this point. That's another road game. And so I think based upon the committee's jumbled math, they equate for a little bit more when it's on the road. I'm it's tough, right? I'm looking at Oregon right now.
Yep.
We have them 13th in the country in our power rating. I don't know what to do with them. I don't know how you get them to 4. I don't even understand how they're in the top 4. I understand the win at Ohio State looks good, but I don't have Oregon in the top 4. I think Cincinnati got absolutely shafted. And I'm not trying to be like wow guy here, but I'm looking at our power numbers right now. Cincinnati would be a 2.5-point favorite on a neutral against Oregon.
Well,
I think they got shafted, and I think the committee, the one thing that I was reading this morning, because I didn't, take time to watch the charade last night, But the one thing I was reading was that the committee was basically came out flat out said Cincinnati didn't play anybody. And I would kind of take offense to that because you went on the road at Indiana, and I don't think when you scheduled the game that you knew Michael Penix was going to be out and Indiana was going to be a disaster. I didn't think when you scheduled the game that you knew UCF was going to have a transition of coaches and lose one of the best quarterbacks in the country. So we view these things in the moment as like, oh, they didn't play anybody. It was a decent schedule based upon their conference coming into the year.
Yeah, I mean, and then you look at what the committee does at the back half. Obviously, when you don't include SMU or Houston anywhere inside the top 25, it eliminates any chance that Cincinnati has for a resume-building win down the stretch. Meanwhile, you want to bolster what the Big Ten does. You put Minnesota at number 20. Go through the Golden Gophers resume and try and figure out what that team has accomplished. Yes, they figured things out. Yes, they've lost 2 of their top running backs, but you still have a loss on your resume to Bowling Green. I know your other loss comes against Ohio State, but you're not the 20th best team in the country. You have an inside track theoretically to get to the Big Ten West if you win out, but so much of this stuff obviously is politicking, it's posturing, and in regards to Cincinnati, I mean, talking about them not only being favored over Oregon on a neutral, I would say other than the top 3 teams, which we all know to be Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State. How people want to address those 3 teams is entirely their prerogative. There is a massive drop-off, and I'll say from the eye test, and I don't know what you guys have for your numbers, that as far as trench warfare is concerned, I don't think Cincinnati would give up all that much, even if they played in Oklahoma on a neutral field in a college football playoff scenario or a bowl game.
Right now, this will shock people. Now, Oklahoma certainly has a chance to improve, right? Their power numbers would increase substantially. You go on the road and beat Baylor, and you kind of close out the way we think they might be able to. And, what a wake-up call this is. You're in the middle of your bye week, and you're like, shit, the committee makes us 8th. They've told the entire world we haven't played anybody and that they need to wake up. And so I think this is a good thing for Oklahoma as a team. Allows them to potentially build. But right now, Oklahoma -1 on a neutral against Cincinnati. And you mentioned some of the teams in the back half, which allow the NCAA to kind of navigate things. Minnesota's outside the top 40. BYU's hovering around the 50th best team in the country. It's way off. And this isn't surprising, and this is why I don't get worked up over it, right? I mean, this is the organization that makes billions of dollars off kids and then builds fountains to kind of hide the money, right? Like it's not shocking. I think the most shocking thing is, and where the fix would kind of, I don't think they can do this, right? But if Alabama somehow loses another game and finds their way into the top 4, then everyone's just kind of like, this thing's a fraud. I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's going to be a couple spots that open up. Now, Georgia, Alabama is an interesting debate. Right now, we would have Georgia -1.5 on a neutral. Obviously, at that point, Georgia would be in and Alabama would be playing for a lot more.
Yep.
In that game, in theory, although it would be the SEC championship game, so Georgia's not going to toss that thing away. But, I think for the other teams, Alabama losing would be huge. And so there could be a situation right now, and this is why I don't get worked up over this, like Michigan State isn't going to run the table. Geesh, that could come back to bite me in the butt, but Michigan State isn't running the table, right? And if Alabama loses, there's going to be 2 spots open. I'm intrigued to see what they do with Michigan. I don't really know what Michigan is. I think we said their defense was a little bit fraudulent last week, and certainly that came to fruition as they got bullied around. But that's still a game. They're up 30-14 on the road late in the game. And so you look at the win probability stuff, and at least the committees, even though they didn't mean to, they at least kind of navigated the road the right way with Michigan. It's going to be really interesting. But I think there is a way, obviously, for Cincinnati to sneak in there, but it's going to require 2 of those top 4 to be removed.
Yeah, I mean,
and it's going to require Oklahoma, I think, losing a game. I think that's right. That's the way Cincinnati does this, is if Alabama loses to Georgia, Michigan State obviously loses, and then Oklahoma doesn't go 4-0 down the stretch.
Oh,
is that the way they're in?
For sure, and I think they also need a loss from Oregon as well. I can't see an undefeated Cincinnati team jumping Oregon, even if the Ducks finish 12-1, knowing how we feel about.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Two teams, if Alabama loses, they're out. Michigan State isn't going to run the table, they're out. So now all of a sudden you're thinking Georgia, Oregon, if they run the table. And then if Oklahoma doesn't run the table, I think Cincinnati slides in there maybe at 4.
Yeah, I could see that happening. I kind of joked on social media yesterday that the most absurd outcomes would be, and of course, I don't know all the SEC permutations because I haven't sat there with my pen, paper, pencil, whatever it takes to get it done, as if Alabama were to lose the Iron Bowl against Auburn loses this week to Texas A&M. Alabama were to then lose somewhere along the way, say to Auburn in the Iron Bowl. Don't know how that all plays out in terms of a tiebreaker, but Alabama still finds a way to win the SEC West with 2 losses. They then beat Georgia in the SEC championship game. Then I want to know what the committee does. Do they take a 1-loss Georgia who just lost to Alabama, or for the first time in college football playoff history, do we take a 2-loss SEC champion in Alabama? That would, for me, would be the most fascinating potential outcome that you could possibly root for if you're Team Chaos. Clearly not as a Cincinnati fan.
Team Chaos. I like that. The other interesting part to the narrative, and we don't have to spend too much more time here, it's like, Cincinnati played nobody. We're going to exclude them right now. Then all of a sudden you have Wake Forest at 9. It's like, who the hell has Wake Forest played?
Army?
Absolutely.
Virginia?
Nobody. If you look at some of their win probability stuff, right, in their current Pythag, and they're below a 6-win team. So I don't know what they're looking at that would make Wake Forest's schedule substantially more difficult than Cincinnati's. I don't know. Very weird there. I'm hoping Cincinnati, just for the sake of allowing a G5 team, because if a G5 team can't get in there, like Cincinnati,
what are we doing?
Then what are we doing, right? Like you have at this point, I would think a name brand coach, one that could potentially fill one of the large Big Ten vacancy jobs if they were to open. You have Desmond Ridder, who I think is got a decent namesake. He's been there a long time. And you have 2 defenders that are potentially first-round picks. So I don't know what more Cincinnati would need to do. Obviously, right, you got to blow out some teams. You haven't looked good the last 2 weeks. But in terms of a G5 program with cachet in both performance on the field, if they can't get in here, I don't really see a scenario where any G5's ever getting in.
Yeah, I'm kind of right there with you, especially when you consider even what Cincinnati did last year. I mean, going toe-to-toe with Georgia and, of course, different circumstances in that bowl game, they showed that they could at least raise their level of play. I know the rosters aren't the exact same. I'm not saying Cincinnati would hold up against Georgia or Alabama, but if you're not going to give the little guy a seat at the table, I mean, may as well go to a group of 5 playoff completely separate from the college football playoff and fracture the FBS further, because there's no doubt these teams aren't playing the same sport other than collecting paydays from some of the major media companies. Of course, as we've talked about, we'll see these numbers continue to move. And fortunately for anybody that has strong opinions, you can bet all of these yes, no's available on FanDuel. Make sure when you go through, you try and figure out some of the numbers and where you can glean a little bit of value. As we talked about, Georgia, an overwhelming favorite at 1-20 to get into the college football playoff. No other team higher than -165. And that's also Alabama and Ohio State. What's interesting about Alabama at -165, if you believe the Tide have a chance to get in, you're probably better off waiting to bet them on the money line in the SEC title game against the Georgia Bulldogs. So take advantage of those prices, use them, manipulate the markets, and put yourself in the best position to make a few bucks. On to the games, my friend. Should we talk about some of the marquee matchups we highlighted, or the lack thereof, that we have on the docket this weekend?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's go to West Lafayette, where it is the Aforementioned Michigan State Spartans installed as a modest road favorite, laying 3 against the Boilermakers at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total in this game sits at 54. It is up a touch from the open. This will be the first time Michigan State rolls into a football game at 8-0 since they made the college football playoff led by Connor Cook, a game pain that you and I were in attendance for when Alabama absolutely obliterated them in Dallas. Michigan State's defense, well, they rank last in the Big Ten in pass defense and will be trying to stop a Purdue passing attack that ranks 3rd in the conference in throwing the football. That's a matchup we'll get to in a moment. When you look at Purdue, 3-2 in home games versus ranked opponents under Coach Brom, that does include a win against then number 2 Ohio State back in 2018, a game the Boilers won as a double-digit underdog, 49-20. Payne, when we begin to unpack what this Michigan State offense is, there's no doubt it's led by Kenneth Walker. He was as good as advertised against Michigan, but I begin to wonder how much was what Michigan State did offensively versus poor run fills and bad linebacking play that we saw from the Wolverines last weekend.
It was not good. And again, we kind of outlined that. I love Hendon Hutchinson. I just don't know what the rest of Michigan's defense was, and metrically they'd kind of been pushed around in the trenches at times. When I look at this one, and I just kind of think about how Peyton Thorne's trending and played the last few games, and then obviously how Kenneth Walker's playing, and it's at a Heisman level, which is stunning to me. You think about what Wake Forest could be with him. And then you have a situation with Jalen Naylor leaving the Michigan game and not returning, and then being seen on the sideline with his wrist and hand and fingers in a cast. All of that kind of creates a situation where Purdue's focus has to be stopping Kenneth Walker in the ground game. That's it. Like you're selling out to make sure the ground game stopped. Purdue's tackling has to be better. I remember watching the Wisconsin game a few weeks back, and I was like, my God, they're just missing tackles left and right. And I went back last night and looked. There's like 10 missed tackles in that game. And that's important against Kenneth Walker. He was an absolute animal, as you mentioned, against Michigan. Obviously, right, 5 touchdowns. That's what everyone wants to talk about. But he averaged 7 yards after contact last week because he broke 13 tackles. The guy was like a human pinball. So that is the one key. Not just stopping the run, but being better tacklers for Purdue. And I think it's an interesting defensive line. You have, 5 of the top 6 guys returning. Then they added 2 Power 5 transfers to the D-line. You have a big name player in George Karlaftis. I think he's obviously a first-round pick at this point. But I wouldn't call Purdue's D-line dominant by any stretch. They're about national average in defensive line yards and stuff, right? But as a unit, top 25 in EPA per rush allowed and rushing success rate allowed. Defensively, their styles changed a little bit over the years where it's more aggressive. The linebackers can fill and they can play downhill. I think the other interesting thing to factor is Purdue played a very heavy play-action passing offense last week in Nebraska. Now, the final score was quite misleading when you have 4 interceptions and a defensive touchdown. Purdue actually only had a 7% endgame win probability. But, the point is, Adrian Martinez throws with play action nearly 40% of the time. And now Purdue faces a very heavy play action offense with Peyton Thorne, who throws with play action about 40% of the time. So I don't think it shocks Purdue's system here. The focus last week was keep your eyes disciplined. That'll be the same approach this week. And so I think that helps a little bit. When you look at Peyton Thorne, elite quarterback with play action, and probably not a starting Power 5 quarterback when he doesn't throw with play action, just based upon the numbers, right? I mean, they're staggering. Thorne right now, 137 passer rating with play action. 10 of the 15 touchdowns are off play action. Just 1 of the 6 picks are off play action. If you look at non-play action throws, 79 passer rating. His yards per pass attempt dipped 45%, and the mistakes just increased substantially. Metrically, I think Purdue looks great against the pass, top 15 in passing EPA and passing success rate allowed, but I don't see individually a really good cover corner on the roster. So schematically, Purdue's going to have to slow down Jaden Reed. I'm also a little worried with the passing offenses Purdue has played. You're looking at UConn, Notre Dame, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, 5 offenses with an average EPA per pass rank of 107th. But I think if Purdue can slow down Walker and Thorne kind of continues this downtrend, Purdue can absolutely put a little scare into Sparty here.
You know, when you look at this Boilers team, you're right. It's interesting because last weekend, clearly the final score misleading, 28-23, a game they trailed going into the break and took advantage of an opportunistic defense. We've seen the Boilers struggle to handle physically imposing ground games already this season and losses against Minnesota and Wisconsin. For Purdue, some of their success, or if they're going to have some on the other side of the ball, obviously hinges on Aiden O'Connell's ability to serve as a distributor more than anything else. We know that there aren't a ton of playmakers wearing black and gold, especially in the ground game, now that they've lost one of their starting running backs. King Daru, more of a plotter than anything else. And I don't want to oversimplify the matchup when you look at Michigan State, that has more questions, in my opinion, than answers on the defensive side of the ball. Will the Spartans have enough in their secondary to slow down the bell cow, to speak, for Purdue, and of course David Bell, the game-breaking wide receiver?
It's interesting because, we watched that game last week and we were kind of texting back and forth and we were on the phone as we watched it because we were doing some contest stuff. But the one thing that I noticed with why Sparty's secondary was a little susceptible to the pass, and Cade McNamara, I thought, played fantastic. And Harbaugh kind of crushed his confidence. But you saw a defense that was absolutely selling out to stop the run. And so it left them a little bit vulnerable in the back. And I don't know if Purdue has that ground game to force them to be exposed in the back this week. And that's, I think, the interesting kind of dichotomy week to week between the two offenses that they're going to play. Now, I think Aiden O'Connell, you mentioned him. He's the other ingredient for beating Michigan State, and it's, you don't know what you're going to get, right? Like, do you get the Iowa and Nebraska version of Aiden O'Connell or the turnover machine against Wisconsin and Notre Dame? That, I think, probably is the big question. I know Michigan State's defensive line isn't the most stout, but Purdue doesn't really have a ground game to speak of, and the O-line has been really poor. And that's as nice as you can put it. The O-line 124th in line yards, 120th in opportunity rate. Over 24% of Purdue's runs have been stuffed at or behind the line of scrimmage. All said, 124th in rushing EPA. So you're going into this handicap saying any efficiency Purdue has on the ground is really a bonus. And you really have to project a one-dimensional offense with Aiden O'Connell just chucking. And it's a decent passing offense. Purdue's been around the national average in throwing efficiency, 51st in passing success rate, 62nd in EPA per pass. The secondary is kind of where Sparty seems vulnerable on defense, but you kind of mentioned David Bell. The guy's an absolute horse, but it can't be just him, right? Like, defenses are keying on him. Michigan State obviously will too. He's been good enough to be the focal point of defenses and still beat them when the competition hasn't been great. Like, Wisconsin basically removed him. But Purdue needs guys like Wright and Sheffield to step up. And there was an interesting contribution last week from Jackson Anthrop, who is a sixth-year guy. They basically used him at running back. They used him in the slot. They used him, in the run game and on special teams. He had 11 touches. So we'll see if that kind of continues this week. It'll be interesting to see if, that versatility kind of helps with Purdue's offense. The other key here is finishing drives. When you're one-dimensional and space starts to shrink, not being able to run it becomes a problem. And that's where Sparty's defense has been outstanding this year. It's why they're undefeated, despite like the win probability charts indicating they're more of like a two-loss team at this point. Sparty is beatable in the middle part of the field, but they're 8th in points allowed per trip inside the 40, and they're 5th in goal-to-goal touchdown rate allowed. So somehow Purdue, when they drive it, has to get touchdowns here to pull off this upset, but the metrics would indicate because they can't run it, they're probably not going to have great success once they get inside the red and green zones punching in for touchdowns. But, we'll see. That's why they play the games, and Sparty's obviously due for some regression in that area. But that's what it's going to take, right? You're going to need a day from Aiden O'Connell. You're going to need just enough ground punch, and you're going to need to be able to defensively stop Kenneth Walker. Line certainly says Purdue's the side here, though, right?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about, the number, knowing that we've seen betting markets get significantly more sophisticated over the years, because when we started doing this, 10 or 15 years ago, there's no doubt that you would have had to pay a premium if you wanted to lay points with Michigan State on the heels of their big win against an in-state rival. But here we are, no wiggle room whatsoever with Michigan State just a field goal favorite. It's very close to where I made the number. Now, if I make a situational adjustment, I can make a case for Purdue offering up some value. But you kind of talked about their game last weekend against Nebraska. It becomes a catch-22. Yes, you make the situational adjustment for Michigan State off of a massive win where they had to erase a 16-point deficit against an in-state rival. But at the same time, you also are a little bit concerned about Purdue, who defied the mathematical probabilities and what the box score told you in their outright victory against Nebraska is more than a touchdown underdog.
Yeah, and that's obviously the interesting juggling of this, because when you go in and you're like, oh my God, Purdue won outright on the road at Nebraska as a 7.5-point underdog, and that game took serious pro money on the favorite. You're like, ooh, I'm ready to upgrade those guys. And then all of a sudden you dig into the game, you're like, oh my God, they had a 7% win probability. And, it was Adrian Martinez turning the ball over a bunch, 4 interceptions.
You could have just said it was Nebraska being Nebraska, and that would have made it a lot easier for our listeners to understand, buddy.
And one of those interceptions is a pick six, and they you kind of look at the vibe of the game, right? Like Purdue gets the momentum score out of the half, or before the break, and then you get Nebraska throwing the pick six kind of around midfield, which is a crucial drive at that point. So you had like all of the big plays also go against Nebraska in combination with the interception. So I didn't upgrade Purdue off that win.
Nebraska.
And then Michigan State, I get, you get down 30-14 at home, and it's tough to like upgrade a team. But I liked the bounce back. We did upgrade Michigan State slightly. We made this game like closer to 4 than 3.
So there you go. It tells you all you need to know when you try and identify situations, spots, matchups, and of course, line value. The best bets oftentimes are where you can check the boxes for multiple categories. It becomes a little bit more perilous when you try and read the market sometimes and you figure out a lot of the other extenuating circumstances. To the SEC, so you don't have to talk about more Big Ten football. Do you feel more comfortable going down south?
Yes, that works.
All right. Texas A&M, they'll welcome in the Auburn Tigers. And Auburn Tigers fresh off of back-to-back wins against SEC West opponents. A&M comes into this week's game off of bye in their own right. 4.5-point favorites at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total on the game sits at 49.5. When you begin to look at what you're going to have here, Auburn, well, they haven't exactly played A&M all that often in College Station when you look back over the short history of these two teams in the same league, but they've never lost in College Station. This will be the third matchup as ranked teams since the Aggies joined the SEC. When we look at Auburn, there were all sorts of questions before the season started. Were they making the right decision in bringing in a coach like Bryan Harsin, who had never coached down south? We weren't quite sure how he was going to handle life outside the Pacific Northwest. I think through the first 8 games, Auburn fans have to be extremely excited. He's gotten Bo Nix to play within himself. We're seeing a physically imposing ground game for stretches with Tank Bigsby and Jarquez Hunter. But this pain seems to be a step up in class when you're going up against a rested Aggies defense that's been outstanding on all 3 levels, at least over the last couple of weeks. They've erased some of the concerns we had early on in the season with a loss against Arkansas, even a loss against Mississippi State. And here's a team trending in the right direction, mainly because they're getting a little bit more reliable quarterback play in the form of Zach Calzada.
Yeah, looking at A&M's offense, Jimbo's a great coach. Let's just kind of start there. And obviously, him and his agent, Jimmy Sexton, have the oil money by the balls. And Jimbo is certainly needy and presses for more virtually every day. But he can recruit. He can coach. Sometimes he tries to be a little too sophisticated offensively, and you hear him and his pressers kind of throw jabs at all the gimmick offenses going on in college football. But I think what he's done with Zach Calzada has been really, really impressive. I mean, what I saw against Colorado, regardless of the come-from-behind touchdown, was a quarterback that wasn't very good. And the pocket really kind of looked like the moon to him. And he had happy feet. And I think when you consider the opponent, A&M's offense didn't really look good against New Mexico. They struggled against Arkansas. Most of the metrics show that kind of was the basement, I would say, of A&M's offense this season. But one thing you have to do is kind of look at weighted metrics and, look at trend lines and see how teams are in their kind of current form. And if you're envisioning A&M's offense as a stock, it's been going up from the Mississippi State game onward. And you can just look at it in the numbers. 44% success rate against Mississippi State. I know that was a loss. 47% success against Bama. 54% success against Mizzou. And then before the bye against South Carolina, 60% success. And now you get Jimbo with a bye week. And I think that's, from what I know at Florida State, his team seemed to improve out of the bye, players, quarterbacks. And so you're going to see probably a little bit different of a Zach Calzada here. I would guess there's been a lot of work kind of refining his mechanics and things of that nature. I think there'll be more incorporation of things that he likes and is actually good at. And I don't think he goes in and lights up Auburn here. But there are plays to be made against Auburn secondary. They kind of let you have the short and intermediate stuff. They're okay giving up the 7-8 yard throw. Auburn's 93rd in passing success rate defense. They try to limit the explosiveness. A&M's done a really good job bypassing third downs on early downs, 25th in the country there. And if you look at Auburn defensively, they're outside the top 75 in that metric. From what I have watched and the competition faced, I also don't think Auburn's run defense is as good as the success rate metric indicates. They're actually outside the top 50 in EPA per rush. I think Spiller and Ochnay are probably a really good running back duo. You could argue that they might be one of the best in the country, almost 1,400 yards between them. If you look at their explosive rates, roughly 20% combined. I think A&M's able to find a little success on the ground here. Now, again, I think the number's a little weird. It didn't get me to 5 where this opened, so it doesn't completely surprise me. It's as low as 3.5 at some of the sharper shops this morning, but I am intrigued to see where this line goes because, Todd, you and I talked off air a little bit. Candidly, I'm not sure you could hand me a free ticket on Auburn this week.
I mean, I can't dispute any of that, and I think it's interesting because Auburn's a team, we talk about it all the time, that the betting market appears to have struggled with, at least in some capacity. There was no money that came in on Auburn when they went into Fayetteville and knocked off Arkansas in convincing fashion, 38-23. Last week, you did see some professional money come in on Auburn against Ole Miss, but it begs the question, was that more about backing Auburn in that spot or betting against an Ole Miss team that was down plenty of weapons? We go back even further than that against Georgia. There was very real money that came in on Auburn. Of course, there were questions swirling about Georgia's starting quarterback. And then the week before that, we knew professionals took a position against LSU, which at the time, LSU, the wheels hadn't completely fallen off like they had now, but that was the beginning of the end. And they were one Bo Nix ridiculous play on fourth down from probably losing that game as well. Whereas to your point with A&M, I don't think the betting market has quite had a great pulse on what to expect from the Aggies on a week in, week out basis. We'll see a lot more, obviously, for how they finish the season, not only with a home game here, but road trips left against Ole Miss and LSU to close things out with a layup against Prairie View A&M sandwiched in there. And of course, if you're trying to make a case for A&M, you talked about their dynamic ground game. We've seen Jalen Weidemeyer kind of take control at the tight end position of a pro-style offense, and the best thing that you can have for a relatively inaccurate quarterback still getting his feet wet is a large target, and that's where it's really paid dividends. But the strength of this A&M team coming into the season, Payne, and it really hasn't disappointed, has been along that defensive line and in through the secondary. I mean, this is a group allowing a shade more than 16 points per game, tied for top 5 in the country in that particular department. You've seen the likes of Tyree Johnson, DeMarvin Leal, Jaden Peavy, and Michael Clemens really start to figure out exactly what's being asked of them. And while Missouri and South Carolina are far from a murderer's row, A&M did exactly what you'd expect an elite level defense to do, completely took them out of the game, didn't allow South Carolina to convert on any of their first 10 third down attempts while the game was still hanging in the balance. In comes Auburn, road Bo Nix, maybe a thing of the past. We know Auburn wants to run to set up the pass, but when you look at that side of the ball, does Auburn have enough consistency to look to move the ball, drive in, drive out against this A&M stop unit?
Listen, I was impressed with Auburn's offense last week with how they came out. I mean, they were on fire early. It kind of felt like the game was too fast for Ole Miss. It looked like they were playing with 8 defenders at times. And Auburn had a 60% success rate in the first half. I thought Nix was really accurate, especially when the offensive line protected him. Didn't have a single turnover-worthy throw all game. We know that Bo Nix is a threat on the ground. That's something that we outlined as one of the larger key factors last week, being that like third guy. And he didn't really disappoint. I'm looking at some of these numbers. Delivered a positive 1.29 rushing EPA for the game, which is just a monster number. But now it's a little different, right? You're facing A&M on the road. They've had 2 weeks to prepare. Different animal, right, than the Rebels defense at home when you've had 2 weeks to prepare. A&M's defense is really good across the board, and I thought we kind of came into the season saying, this could be a top 5 defense if they played at peak. They haven't quite played that well, but, fringe top 10 in both rushing and passing EPA allowed, top 25 in both rushing and passing success rate allowed. Only 40% of opponent drives have graded productive. And I think this probably is a large step up in class for Auburn. I like what Bryan Harsin's done. I'll kind of
You're a big Mike Bobo fan.
There. Yeah, it's really interesting because didn't really think much of him as a head coach, but he seems to be doing okay with the offense. It was an interesting hire, but whatever him and Harsin are doing, they're getting the most out of Bo Nix. You can't really debate that. I mean, Nix has played the best ball that he's ever played. And really, the cupboard wasn't bare for either of those guys. It was just getting the players that they didn't recruit to buy in. And so far, I think they've done that. Now, when I look at Auburn's offense and you kind of mesh it with a defense in A&M's weight class, they weren't overly productive against the Penn States and the Georgias, right? And that's kind of how you have to comp this game out. And I understand when you're playing, better defenses, it's not overly surprising that your offense isn't as good, but it is worth mentioning those comps because that's the weight class you're fighting in this week. And when you're breaking down this game, I think it's probably pretty important. And in those 2 games, Bo Nix completed just 56% of his passes, had a 10% interceptable pass rate, averaged just 5.3 yards an attempt. Auburn, kind of to your point, doesn't have receivers. They're going to scare or threaten you. It's not an explosive passing offense. And in those 2 games, Bo Nix's receivers didn't really help him or step up at all. 11% drop rate against Penn State and Georgia. So if Auburn can't really run the ball, this game will probably not go very well for Auburn. And I love Bigsby and Hunter, right? That's a 1-2 punch that's just fantastic. Their styles complement each other. And A&M hasn't been completely dominant up front. Sometimes A&M does get a little too aggressive. They lose some gap control. But I think, when you look at them, they love to create the negative play, 24% run stuff rate. But again, they at times, just from what I've seen, they lose the gap integrity. But they're good, right? And they're rested. And I just don't see a situation, Todd, where if Auburn isn't semi-successful on the ground, that Bo Nix with that receiver group is going to consistently move it on A&M secondary. And the other factor here is when you look at some of where A&M's defense has been great, and again, very good against the pass, but they really hunker down when teams get inside their 40, allowing 2.5 points per trip inside the 40. So even if you are able on the rare occasions to move it against A&M, between the 40s, they really buckle down. And they just, I'm looking at these numbers, they don't even really give up field goals in some of those situations. So that'll be another factor here. But I just don't know if Auburn's offense has enough juice against A&M.
As far as the number, I know we touched on it. We've seen a little bit of money come in the favorite at some shops. You've also seen a touch of under money come in as well. We know Jimbo Fischer, one thing that he's been synonymous with is slowing the game down, not necessarily utilizing his talent advantage. When you look pace metrics, Texas A&M, of course, in the lower third of the country. Auburn somewhere, right outside the top 20, top 25. A&M, you think, in your opinion, will be able to slow this thing down and play in their comfort zone much more than Auburn's ability to speed it up?
Yeah, I think it's always a little bit easier to slow a game down. Now, if you are game planning for Texas A&M, I think probably the goal is to tire out that defensive line, so your run game that's gaining, 3 yards a pop in the first half can then gain 4, 5, 6 yards in the second half. But suddenly, you have a couple 3-and-outs, and that strategy suddenly gets reversed, right? Your defense is living on the field, and A&M's ground game gets going. So it is that balancing approach. But you're spot on. A&M just inside the top 100 in plays per minute. And that's really been the knock on Jimbo, right? Is when you are that talented, you want more plays in a game, but that just hasn't been his style. And obviously when his starting quarterback goes down, he slowed it down a little bit more with Calzada. We'll see. And there's probably going to be a wrinkle or two off the bye for Jimbo this week, Todd.
Yeah, you figure you try, get a trick play in there. You come out with maybe play with a little tempo early on, force Auburn to play from behind, and you'll be in decent shape in that spot. But should be an interesting game, a de facto elimination race of sorts for two second-tier teams, I guess, that are a cup below Alabama in terms of their having at least a path. They're going to need some help to get to the SEC title game as representatives of the West. Full disclosure here, Payne, when we went through the board this weekend, we tried to find 5 games to deep dive. We could really only find 2, and I'm not sure people are going to go, well, wait a second, where are you guys going for the other single factors that you want to try and break down some of these games? It will have a distinctly SEC flair to it. And I think a game that'll be a fun watch in Lexington under the lights at Kroger Field is the Kentucky Wildcats, who will welcome in an SEC East rival in the Tennessee Volunteers. You're looking at Kentucky as a 2-point home favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total on this game sits at 57.5. Of course, Kentucky started the season like a house on fire, going 6-0. They've now lost back-to-back games. But more importantly, the Wildcats have allowed 30-plus after going 8 straight without doing so. But when you look at Kentucky, one thing that you've been able to lean on under Coach Stoops, they've been outstanding at the betting window, going 14-4 against the number the last 18 games played at home. But in comes a rested Vol side with a quarterback growing in confidence in Hendon Hooker. When you look at this game, Payne, I don't want to oversimplify things, but is it as straightforward as Kentucky's ability to run the ball, keep that high-powered Tennessee offense on the sidelines, and Tennessee's ability to get stops against Chris Rodriguez and company?
And I think that's probably the biggest thing here. It's when you look at Kentucky and the games they win, they're able to run the ball. When they can't run it, they lose these games. And, without bearing the lead, you mentioned the price at the top. Monday morning, Tennessee got absolutely smoked, +3, and it's why we're down to 1 at most shops. And, if I'm looking at Pinnacle, probably the next respected bet they take on Tennessee, that'll flip the favorite. So it'll be interesting to see where this line heads from here, but some serious money on Tennessee early in this week, and it's not a dummy. Part of this is because Tennessee's coming off the bye and they're healthy, and you hear kind of what some of the Vols players are saying about this being personal after Kentucky went into Neyland Stadium and won last year for the first time since '84. The bigger reason, obviously, is Kentucky's dealing with some injuries. Both sides of the ball, guys on the defensive line, guys in the secondary, and it's already a poor Kentucky secondary. And then you have the question with Chris Rodriguez. And if you use the parallel, he's kind of the Derrick Henry of Kentucky. He is the engine to the offense. Everything the offense does is based around him, whether it's run or play action pass off of that run. Rodriguez is going to play. But he's dealing with some personal things if you've done some reading, and he's also dealing with 2 injuries, one of which is a wrist injury, and that's why he fumbled last week. The 2 games Kentucky's lost this season are the 2 games where they've had a negative EPA per rush. So obviously that is going to be the key here is, can Kentucky do what they do best? On paper, that should happen. There is a mismatch, right, in the trenches here. Kentucky's offensive line, they have been dominant this season. You have some upperclassmen. You brought in a transfer. They're 3rd in line yards. They're number 1 in opportunity rate. Defense have only stuffed 11% of runs at or behind the line of scrimmage. And then you flip it around and look at Tennessee's defensive line. Very middling. 62nd in line yards, 55th in rushing success rate allowed, 75th in EPA per rush. And so Chris Rodriguez and Smoke are going to have to be able to run the ball, play keep away, kind of to your point, because I think there's probably plays to be made for Hendon Hooker in the pass game. We've made our feelings known about Will Levis. I think he is probably a slight upgrade over the previous Kentucky quarterbacks through the air, but I don't believe he's the solution to what this offense wants to be. It's basically play action or bust for him. I think there's going to be some opportunities off the run game to hit some explosives on Tennessee secondary. But Will Levis is going to have to connect. And right now, he hasn't really proven that. He's not pushing the ball down the field. He's basically been afraid to do so. And I believe right now his deep pass rate since week 4 is like 5%. And since week 4, he's 0 for 10 on deep passes, and only one of those 10 deep throws has actually been accurate. But that's what this is going to require to kind of win this game and buck the steam, so to speak, here, is that Kentucky's got to be able to run the ball. And Will Levis is going to have to make an explosive pass or two off play action. But I really, really respect that Tennessee money that came in early this week.
You know, it's so interesting. I mean, you talk about the EPA numbers, and the stats obviously bear that out. When you look at what Kentucky has done just from a raw yardage standpoint, 66 rushing yards marked the second straight game that they were under 70 on the ground. And you're exactly right. Talking about Will Levis and some of the concerns we had coming in, Kentucky was anointing him the great white hope of sorts to pick up where Tim Couch left off, running the air raid offense. And it hasn't exactly gone according to suit. When you look at Levis throwing a career high 3 interceptions last week, finished the game 17 of 28. I mean, interesting team to say the least. And as you talk about,
were you saying Samuel L. Jackson was Will Levis's handler?
I mean, he might help. He probably needs anything he can to head in the right direction. So it's interesting because Kentucky fans clearly thought they had a chance to go into Georgia and compete. That didn't happen, and suddenly here we are with the ideas of an 11-1 regular season or 10-2 hanging on by a thread, given what the market suggests in this particular spot. I'm curious to see if Tennessee, coming out of the bye, we get the good Hendon Hooker. It's amazing to see the difference that he's made to this Tennessee offense as well, as the Vols have been much more dynamic on that side of the ball since making the change from Joe Milton, best known to try and throw footballs through people's bodies more so than hit the receivers in the hands, allowing them to make catches or runs after the catch.
Yeah. I mean, Hooker has been dynamic, and he's able to throw with touch, which Milton doesn't have, and Kentucky's secondary is extremely vulnerable outside the top 100 in a lot of important metrics. So that'll be the key in this game is, Kentucky maintaining possession, being able to run the ball, and then hopefully getting Tennessee in some early down situations that at least allow the defense to be in some better situations with Hooker throwing in, third and medium and third and long to kind of negate some of those woes the secondary does have.
You want to spend some time picking on the Pac-12 because we haven't done that enough since the top of the show, where you belittled Oregon and all of our loyal listeners in the great city of Eugene throughout the Pacific Northwest have probably long since turned off the show.
Sure. No problem with that. And I think they'll probably like what I have to say.
You can send all of your hate to Payne on Twitter, at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there as well. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Oregon in Seattle to take on the Washington Huskies, and FanDuel Sportsbook makes Oregon a 6.5-point favorite, number trending towards a full touchdown. Total on the game sits at 51.5. When you look at Oregon, they set season highs last week against Colorado, 31 first half points, 52 for the game, 568 yards offensively, and it did mark just the second time this year that Oregon has beaten an FBS opponent by more than 7 points, although people will obviously debate the point if Colorado is actually an FBS caliber opponent, the same way they will with Arizona. Oregon built a 21-0 lead after the first 3 drives of the game, and it was essentially over for all intents and purposes. Unfortunately for folks that laid 23.5 or greater with Oregon, you were done in a dirty fate with Colorado getting in through the back door. There is a little bit, obviously, a war of words taking place here. Jimmy Lake talking about the academic prowess or lack thereof for Oregon. Interesting comments for a coach who hasn't quite figured out how to use math to his advantage and actually attack defenses in space. Washington forced out of the Pac-12 title game last year because of COVID protocols, so a little bit of revenge there that I'm sure they would like to try and get things on track. But it's also the first time that Washington will play a ranked team in 685 days. This isn't much of a rivalry, Payne. Oregon has won 14 of the last 16, and something tells me history could repeat itself come Saturday evening.
And some of those were better Washington teams and lesser Oregon teams than what we have on display here. So this is really an uphill battle for Washington. And I love that the games we're breaking down are a little bit old school, right? Like when you're looking at this one, it's all about the run game. I mean, who said running the football was dead in 2021? And just on paper, this is one of the largest matchup mismatches of the entire Week 10 card. You mentioned Jimmy Lake, not the best quotes this week. And obviously we have given him shit for making possibly the worst offensive coordinator hire in the entire country, but he's also managed as a defensive-minded guy to ruin the defense as well.
That's impressive. When you can ruin things that fit your skill set, that's impressive.
Washington cannot stop the run. I mean, at all. And I understand they play a 4-2-5, and so they're going to be a little light, but the goal is not to be shredded the way that they've been shredded. Washington's front seven is effectively little brother in the driveway, just getting backed down by big brother. Washington right now, 124th in defensive line yards. 53% of the time, opposing offensive lines create at least 4 yards of room for its running backs. Washington only stuffs 12% of runs at or behind the line of scrimmage. So, bottom line, the D-line just struggles at the point of attack, and it kind of leads to this trickle-down effect. And you're looking at a run defense 111th in rushing success rate allowed. Down to down, very bad. They also give up explosives, and that's why they're 113th in EPA per rush allowed. So opposing run offenses are good down to down. They are good hitting explosive runs. The entire makeup of Mario Cristobal's version of Oregon is recruiting, the biggest, baddest, and toughest offensive lineman. He obviously was one. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that the Ducks O-line, third in line yards, second in opportunity rate, number one in the country, only allowing 10% of runs to be stuffed. So, and this is just a monster mismatch in the trenches here. The Ducks are top 10 in both rushing success rate and EPA per rush. Oregon's going to be able to win the early down battle, and that should leave them in second and third and short most of this game. Early in the week, we had, the nickel and dime bettors that are respected lay it with Oregon -6. Last night, as I was kind of finishing my prep on this game, Todd, a group came in, laid the 6.5, and that is why we are out to 7. And you mentioned the quote from Jimmy Lake. Obviously, that's going to provide some bulletin board material. And I don't know how that guy kind of had the confidence to unleash what he said, but I think this is a game where Oregon has the chance to roll it up on Washington here, and I don't think they take the foot off the gas if there's that opportunity. And because of that mismatch on the ground, you could have an Oregon team that says, hey, we're pretending to shut this thing down, but we can still run it down your throat and score points that way. So I kind of agree with this line movement. Traditionally, again, if this were 10 years ago, everyone would be looking towards the home dog here, but the matchup is really bad. The motivation's really bad. And Jimmy Lake is just really bad.
This, for me, has all the makings of a dog with fleas. And when you look at this Oregon offense, we know Travis Dye has taken on increased responsibility with the injury to C.J. Verdell. I think a breath of fresh air. We got a glimpse of the future in Eugene with a 4-star recruit in Brian Cardwell, who carried the ball 7 times for 127 yards. Have to imagine he will get a fair share of touches in this particular spot as well. And for all the reasons that you highlighted, I mean, there's no reason to believe that Washington will have a tactical advantage, especially when you look at how conservative they are by nature on offense and the limited playmakers they have on that side of the ball. Breaking news, by the way, Payne, I know you're always much more disciplined about this than I am in terms of putting your phone to the side. One of the NFL games, a marquee game this upcoming weekend, will lose one of its marquee players. The Green Bay Packers will be without Aaron Rodgers for their trip to Kansas City to take on the Chiefs. COVID protocols there. It's a game that obviously we'll break down, or maybe we won't now, in greater detail on the NFL podcast. This, of course, won't be news to a lot of our loyal listeners, though, by the time this podcast breaks.
That's not good, but it is good for those that took under 55.5 yesterday. Congratulations to those fellas. I will have to assess that situation once we get off, but certainly not the best news for Green Bay. That is for sure.
No.
However, all things right in the land of Mahomes. Oh, that is a big help.
Here we go.
Obviously,
Here we go.
Getting a nice defensive end as we projected helps. Just hoping they would land Devontae Parker. Those conversations stalled a little bit. Big game for the Chiefs. Got to get back above 500, buddy.
6 degrees of separation for Payne Insider
I do love
and
that,
Patrick Mahomes.
I do love that all my optimism has turned you into a Chiefs hater, because like 2 weeks ago you were on board, right? 2 weeks ago you were like, oh my God, this offense is really dynamic and the only thing that's happening here is the turnovers. And then I get like texts and I see you online like, this offense just stinks.
We got Gunslinger Mahomes. That's what we got. We got Gunslinger Mahomes out here slingshotting the ball from a interesting launch angle. We got a team that didn't want to run the ball against it to lighter boxes. Then suddenly we get the emergence of Derek Gore and that 20-point outburst against the Giants. I know we're working with borrowed time, that Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes will get it figured out, but I have to take my shots while I can, because I'm going to have to listen to you for the next 10 to 12 years, be unbearable about what Patrick Mahomes means to the sport and how dynamic he is in command of the NFC West.
I never wish harm on anybody, but if Jackson Mahomes broke a leg and wasn't able to attend games anymore, that'd be fantastic. And, you know, just too much distraction going on right now for Mahomes. Hopefully they get that thing figured out.
That's what happens when you have to try and figure out how to make the Kansas City Royals relevant. You can understand why he's a little bit distracted when he sees that roster from game 1 through game 162. But, of course, I don't want to get too far off topic.
What happened last night? I mean, how did Kansas City let Solar go?
I mean, you have to give the Braves credit. I mean, our Yankees go out there and acquire every big-ticket item in Joey Gallo and Anthony Rizzo. Meanwhile, here are the Braves cobbling together a lineup with Eddie Rosario, Jock Peterson, Adam Duvall, and Jorge Soler as key contributors en route to their first World Series in almost 30 years.
Just get hot, baby. Stop throwing jabs at Rizzo, by the way.
No, Rizzo's, he's going to be the cornerstone of our Yankee team going forward. You know my feelings about local Las Vegas Joey Gallo. I don't think the Yankees need more guys that are home run or bust in that lineup.
We had some data entry issues for Green Bay and Kansas City. Somebody just posted the total at 27. Even with Aaron Rodgers out, I'm going to say it's a touch off.
I mean, I'd want to go over 27 if I was given that opportunity. I'm not quite sure I'll be able to sneak a bet in fast enough to be able to take advantage in that regard. All right, we got one last game to go, and this is more about name cachet more so than anything that we're going to see from a level of competition. And of course, it's an evening affair in Tuscaloosa where Alabama can put the final nail in LSU's coffin, although they think they've been dead about 37 times so far this season. Crimson Tide, more than a 4-touchdown favorite. Total in this game, 66. When you look at Alabama, they've won 9 out of the last 10. LSU's last victory came back in 2019 en route to the national title. Interesting, if you do your reading this week, Alabama players have not forgotten what it felt like for LSU players to celebrate on their field at Bryant-Denny. Not quite sure that's going to set up all that well. Second straight season that LSU goes into their annual showdown against Alabama unranked. It hasn't happened since 2000 to 2001. LSU has more or less ran a gauntlet over their last 5 games. Ole Miss, Florida, Kentucky, Auburn, and Mississippi State against an Alabama offense that's now scored 30 or more points in 34 straight games, the longest streak in FBS history. No reason to believe it's going to stop on Saturday with an Alabama team that's won its last 2 games by a combined 68 points since losing to Texas A&M as a 19.5-point favorite. I give you all of this pain to read Ed Orgeron's quote. When Coach O was asked about the number on being a 28-point underdog, we don't pay attention to that. This is the first I heard of it. I remember I was at Ole Miss. We came to play LSU when we were a 27-point underdog and we went into overtime. Those games can go either way. They're a very good football team. Give them credit, but we're going to be ready to play. Does LSU have enough to sneak inside the 4-touchdown tariff?
That is the big question. And we're talking about this game, obviously, because of program stature, and it's a rivalry game. Alabama's going to win this game. That's not the question, right? The question is by how much. And kind of digging through some numbers and doing some reading as you did, there's really two things LSU has to do to stay within this number and not get humiliated. And the first is through the air. Max Johnson and LSU's passing game has to have success here. And if you look at season-long metrics, it would appear, they have a chance through the air against Alabama. Secondary's kind of been the weak spot of Bama's defense outside the top 50 in both passing success rate and EPA per pass allowed. LSU's offense checks in top 15 in both those categories. The problem is, and where the Spidey senses are kind of kicking in, and I think off the bye, Saban probably gets that cleaned up a little bit, especially after you give up 250-plus yard touchdown bombs to Tennessee, and that's probably going to put an emphasis on that area of your defense during the bye. Chunk plays through the air have been a serious problem, though. And again, I think it gets cleaned up a little bit, but it isn't going to be a quick fix. It isn't going to be something that isn't a vulnerability for them moving forward. Right now, Alabama allowing 53% of throws 10-plus yards downfield to be completed. That is just not good, right? Bad.
Not good, Clark.
Very bad.
Not good.
9% worse than last season, 20% worse than 2019. So that is certainly going to be an area a defensive backs coach like Nick Saban is going to try to rectify during the bye. For LSU, you probably have to look at how they're trending through the air without Kayshon Boutte. Not great. Obviously, Max Johnson looked good in the shootout against Florida, despite some, turnovers. But the last time out against Ole Miss, a defense that's outside the top 100 in passing defense, Max Johnson put up a negative passing EPA. So you do kind of have to wait out what the LSU pass attack is without Boutte. And I think that makes things a little bit different here. The second area where LSU has to be effective to have a chance is actually on the other side of the ball. And Todd, I think we did a really good job identifying Alabama's protection issues week one against Miami when Bryce Young basically ran for his life and just was fantastic under pressure. But that was kind of the point in time where everyone was already anointing Alabama national champions and there wasn't any weakness. And then all of a sudden you start digging into numbers like, Jesus, this offensive line, which lost a ton of guys to the draft, and they had issues against Miami, and we weren't quite sure what Miami's defensive line was. We thought it would be substantially down, and so that was kind of a glaring weakness for us. And right now, that really hasn't changed all that much. It's gotten slightly better. Again, maybe out of the bye, you see another notch of improvement, but Bryce Young still being pressured on 35% of dropbacks. The other area where Bama's O-line has really struggled this season is against the blitz. Only Navy and Akron are worse in pressure rate allowed versus the blitz. So Durante Jones better figure out a way to scheme up some manufactured pressure, and if he can get some guys home, force a turnover, make Bryce Young uncomfortable, maybe this doesn't become a complete whitewash. But I will say this. You mentioned the quotes. Coming out of the bye, I think Alabama's going to be a little bit more buttoned up. Season-long numbers make this game 28, right on the button. But if I look at our weighted numbers, Todd, it's closer to 34.
It's never a great sign when Alabama's actually being discounted in the market, and you can find nearly a touchdown's worth of wiggle room looking over current form to try and advocate for a game where normally you'd want to come in and go, oh, well, LSU's catching a boatload of points. They're going to put a all-hands-on-deck type effort together. I haven't seen that from Max Johnson, and he's not exactly 100% either, so I'm not quite sure what LSU can do other than maybe go to church a couple times during the week and hope that there's a little bit of divine intervention that allows them to cover as 4 touchdown pups.
Yeah, and so when that is the key factor, right, Max Johnson being able to move the ball through the air, and he's not 100%, and as we alluded to, Boutte is out, becomes a little bit more difficult. And so those are really the only two areas that LSU might have an advantage in is, sending some blitzes and maybe creating some turnovers. Turnovers obviously not predictable, but can certainly swing games, as we saw last week with Arizona State having 3 in the first 11 minutes. So, those are the kind of things that completely flip games on their head. And that's what it's going to take for LSU to stay within this number. Otherwise, this is going to be a boat race. And I don't see Alabama necessarily letting their foot off the gas if there is that opportunity, because, again, they'll probably be able to run the ball here in this situation.
Yeah, trying to figure out what this LSU program is going to look like. I mean, we say it week in, week out, and this will probably be the last time that we touch on LSU football this season when you look at their upcoming schedule. But just 2 years removed from winning a national championship with arguably one of the most dominant teams that we've ever seen play the sport, highlighted by NFL caliber talent all over that roster, to see how far the mighty have fallen. And we'll see what program builder ultimately comes in to try and resurrect what should be one of the elite organizations from top to bottom within the SEC West.
I'm not quite sure who they are. Have you heard anything?
I have not.
Leaning?
No, I have not heard any further updates there. I have not heard any inkling in terms of what direction USC wants to go in either. And it begs the question. I mean, you see Clay Helton, who already found a new job at Georgia Southern. You know, if you're LSU, if you're USC, how quickly do you have to move, and what candidates have you identified that at least you can get a handshake agreement in place that as soon as the regular season's over, inside of less than a month, to try and accelerate that recruiting cycle? Because you know better than I do that this recruiting calendar of events and cycle doesn't really ever stop. So if you had a head coach there, you could really get a leg up on the competition, 3 to 4 weeks before some of your other compatriots try to make a move.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. And that's part of this new early recruiting period day and age of college football is, you constantly are shuffling your coach like we've seen in Florida State, and you're going to be behind the eight ball. And we saw a couple talented kids come out and over the past week, and say what you want about Ed Orgeron being a good X's and O's coach and hiring the right guys, which he's fallen short of, but knocked it out of the park in 2019, and that's why they're able to win the national championship. But he is beloved by players and their parents, and we've seen kids decommit over the last week. We've seen kids that were kind of leaning that way choose another direction because Coach O is gone. So you have to solidify who the coach is going to be, come in, do some damage control. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if you have that coach that's out there and kind of the handshake agreements already in place. But I have not heard any rumblings as to that kind of being potentially solidified behind the scenes. So it'll be interesting to see which direction they go.
Where do you think Coach O goes from here? Do you see a situation where somebody like a Billy Napier gets lured away from Louisiana Lafayette to maybe a Virginia Tech if they part ways with Justin Fuente? Would Orgeron take a job within the state to try and build back up his resume, knowing that he would be looked at as a king at a spot like Louisiana Lafayette? Or do you think he kind of takes a back seat to things and maybe catches on, as a head of recruiting or something else along those lines? I just don't know if he's got the everything you're looking for, to be a full-blown CEO at a Power 5 program. No knock on his resume, as he built obviously out a tremendous staff with coordinators and everything else. I just wonder where his career trajectory takes him, given some of his trials and tribulations off the field, which obviously contributed to his premature departure from Baton Rouge.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Obviously, you're going to have to look into that situation, but there's plenty of G5 programs that would love a nice infusion with the brand that Coach O has. I mean, we saw it just yesterday, right, with Clay Helton kind of going down in class, and I think that might be the way Coach O goes if everything checks out off the field.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. I mean, good coaches, regardless of some of the skill sets and some of their shortcomings, will always find a place in the college football world in a role that best suits some of their talents and sensibilities. 5 games broken down as extensively as we know how around these fine parts. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. Also, FanDuel.com. Use the promo code BetTheBoard. $1,000 free bets, 30-1 enhanced odds prices on some of the marquee games for the National Football League. Everything you could possibly want to add in another sports book to your ever-increasing, growing stable as you shop around for the best of the number. One final order of business, Payne, to try and rectify the dud we steered our loyal listeners to last weekend in Arizona State, a game I watched 2 drives and was damn near ready to put my fist through the TV, wondering what Herm Edwards had done to try and prepare his Sun Devils coming out of the bye week. But we put that in the rear view, whether you lose by half point or you lose by 3 touchdowns. All the bets pay the same. Where do you find ample opportunity for us to make a few dollars this weekend in the college football ranks?
Yeah, we kind of hinted at it a little bit when we were breaking down the selection committee's process. And let's go with rotation number 340, North Carolina. And this is really a byproduct of us not believing Wake Forest is an 8-0 team. And again, if you look at some of the win probability stuff, more like a team in the 5.8 win range. And so I think they are kind of at a market peak with their price. Obviously, North Carolina is having a down season, to put that mildly. I see value in the number. We made this game closer to 4. And when you look at potentially what's at play, this is kind of the game I think that wakes North Carolina up a little bit, right? You have a in-state rivalry. Wake Forest is kind of making some noise. But the other interesting element to this game, Todd, and we talked a little bit off air, is not that Wake Forest is going to go out and lose this game or not kind of play to their peak, but it becomes effectively an out-of-conference game based upon the way it was scheduled. So you can lose this game, and the more important game is still next week against North Carolina State. But I think we're getting good value in the number based upon perception of what Wake Forest is versus reality. I think there's some matchups here to be had for North Carolina's offense, moving the ball through the air and on the ground now that we see that ground game improving a little bit. And you just come back to the talent on North Carolina's defense. I know that they are not performing to expectation, but at some point the talent has got to kick in here. And it is a talent mismatch from that perspective. And so I just think we're getting a bottom barrel price here on North Carolina. Now, the interesting element to this game is, and I'll tell the listeners, you kind of do what you guys want to do in terms of the price. For me, I'm going to be playing the money line. And Todd, you can kind of look at things on the screen right now. But basically, when you are a 2.5-point favorite, the money line should equate to a minus 138. And so it's not doing that right now. In fact, there was one shop that obviously our listeners are familiar with, a past relationship, who is dealing minus 2.5, minus 20, and the money line minus 125. So it was like 18 cents off on the dollar. So that is going to be the way I navigate this game with North Carolina on the money line. If you guys, just based on price, that money line price is better than laying the 2.5. But if you guys don't feel comfortable laying the money line, by all means, lay the 2.5. But that is the way I'm going with the game on North Carolina.
Do you ever feel conflicted when you go against your man crush, Sam Hartman? I don't know if our listeners know how strongly you feel about Sam Hartman as a starting quarterback.
That's my guy. That is my guy. He's going to be in the NFL. Good family situation. Father passed early, raised by his mother. Good kid. Put on a ton of weight. Was willing to go to a program that he could build, which is similar to what he did his final year in high school. Went to a really crap high school program and kind of built that back up based upon a relationship he had with the head coach. He's doing it here with Wake Forest. I think he is mobile enough. He is accurate enough. Got a good enough arm. Tough. I think he finds himself on an NFL roster, so good on him. But yeah, I mean, just a good kid, good quarterback. Definitely hate going against him.
We'll see.
The price is just ridiculous here.
Can root for Wake Forest to still be ACC champs next weekend. We just need them to stub their toe this week against North Carolina. And I have to give both programs credit for having the guts to schedule one another to keep an in-state rivalry together, knowing that they would only play once every 7 years, given the division between the Atlantic and Coastal. And if memory serves me correct, I believe they'll do battle again next year in 2022 as well. Wish more programs would take this proactive approach to beef up their non-conference schedule rather than playing directional schools or FCS opponents, but that's a different discussion for a different day. In Sam Howell and the North Carolina Tar Heels we trust. Josh Downs, may you catch 37 balls and go for 400 yards through the air as a receiver. Any final words of wisdom, parting shots, things you'd like to get off your chest before we take a brief 24-hour break and come back with the National Football League, same time, same place tomorrow?
That is it.
All right.
NFL tomorrow. We'll be back.
All righty, my friends. Best of luck with all of your college football Week 10 investments. And with a North Carolina ticket in hand come Saturday afternoon, we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.